All right, so welcome everyone. This is Drisha's spring program and the fourth class of this session on the Halakhic process, a brief history with Rabbi Jonathan Ziring. We value everyone's active participation. So like I said, we encourage you to turn your cameras on so we can have a class as if we were in person and can see each other if possible. And also feel free to ask questions either by unmuting yourself or by writing them in the chat box on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook if you're watching us live. And with that, I'll turn this to Rabbi Ziring.
Okay, thank you, Evie. So this week we are turning to the age of codes. Right, we're jumping forward in history. Last week was less historical and more of a survey of the extent to which we still derive law from psukim, but from our last historical class 2 weeks ago. So we're jumping forward to the 16th century, more or less. And we're going to discuss the age of codes, when Shulchan Aruch was written, and everything that entailed. Okay, so let's frame ourselves historically, and then try to figure out why it is that suddenly in the 16th century, the new norm for halachic writing became these formalized codes that we now know as the basis, as it were, of halachic literature, and try to understand not only why these codes were written then, but the methods that were used to reach the conclusions, and what this tells us about the development of psak halakhah, and then sort of point in the direction that we're going to take in the next 2 weeks, where we trace it from there to the modern day. So Shulchan Aruch. So what is Shulchan Aruch? So in the limited sense, it refers to the 4-part code of Jewish law that was published by Rabbi Yosef Karo. And I have here in the first source, Professor Rabbi Dr. Isidore Tversky's article, Shulchan Aruch, Enduring Code of Jewish Law, where he gives us a little bit of an outline. Right, so the text itself refers to the 4-volume code of Jewish law written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. The first section, Orach, refers to the laws that deal with holidays and prayer and other daily or calendrically related laws. Yoredeya deals with ritual law. Choshen Mishpat deals with monetary law. And Even Ezer deals with marital law. So at one level, when we talk about Shulchan Aruch, we talk about this 4-volume code that was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, which itself, as we will see, was the summary, the executive summary of his encyclopedic work, the Beit Yosef, which was a commentary on an earlier code, the Arba Turim, written by Rabbi Yaakov Baal HaTurim, the son of Rabbeinu Asher. That's one level at which we talk about the Shulchan Aruch. At a second level, when we talk about the Shulchan Aruch, we don't just mean the text written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, but we mean the enterprise that it began, and all the commentaries that are written as on the side of Shulchan Aruch that really incorporate the primary mode of halachic writing, or at least one of the primary modes of halachic writing for the hundreds of years coming after Shulchan Aruch. So if you look at a page of Shulchan Aruch, what you'll see is in the middle, you will have the text of Rabbi Yosef Karo, who, as Dr. Tversky outlines here, was a Spanish emigre from Toledo. He was born in 1488. He died in 1575. And Shulchan Aruch was published in the 1560s, 1565 and 66. So Rabbi Yosef Karo, he's an emigre from Toledo. He lives in Turkey for a bit, and then finally he settles in Eretz Israel, in Israel, in a period of, as Dr. Tversky writes here, of turbulence and instability and apocalyptic stirrings, with the detailed glosses, both strictures and supplements, of Rabbi Moshe Isserles, about 1525 to 1572, a well-to-do Polish scholar, proud of his Germanic background, who studied in Lublin and became de facto chief rabbi of Krakow in a period of relative stability and tranquility. Right, so we have in the center of the Shulchan Aruch, what we're talking about is really the code written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, and the comments, the additions by the Ashkenazi Polish rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, better known as the Ramah. Why did Shulchan Aruch happen this way? So this is I didn't include this on the sources, but the history basically goes that in the mid-16th century, both Rabbi Yosef Karo writing in Israel and Rabbi Moshe Isserles writing in Krakow and Poland begin to write encyclopedic works of Jewish law, both actually as commentaries on the Torah. Rabbi Yosef Karo writes a book known as the Beit Yosef, and Rabbi Moshe Isserles writes a sefer called the Darkei Moshe. Rabbi Moshe Isserles, as he's about to complete the book, finds out that Rabbi Yosef Karo has been in the middle of writing a similar work to him, and decides that instead of publishing a similar encyclopedic commentary of Jewish law, what he's going to do is write an abbreviated version that will merely add the points upon which he disagrees with Rabbi Yosef Karo. It'll add points, it'll argue, it'll incorporate, as we'll see, Ashkenazi traditions. But fundamentally, the survey component of the Beit Yosef, the Rabbi Moshe Isserles decides he doesn't have to reproduce. And then when Rabbi Yosef Karo writes his executive summary called Shulchan Aruch, this code which is meant not for the rabbinic experts, but rather for the laity as a basic summary of Jewish law, the Ramah does the same thing, and he writes his glosses, known as the Hagot or the Mapa, the tablecloth, as it were, which goes on top of the Shulchan Aruch, because Shulchan Aruch literally means the set table, and therefore the Ramah, who decides to only add his additions, is the Mapa, is the tablecloth that goes on top of it. In the ensuing years, in a century or two following the publishing of Shulchan Aruch, so many commentaries are written on Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. And when people say that we paskin, as it were, we rule like the Shulchan Aruch, they don't usually mean the text only of Rabbi Yosef Karo. They mean Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, plus the major commentaries that surround the Shulchan Aruch that are written in the 17th and 18th centuries. Svarim like the Sefer Me'irat Einayim by Rabbi Yeshua Falk, the Sefer Siftei Kohen, the Shach, written by Rav Shabtai Kohen Rappaport, and then written in the late 19th and 20th century. Many people think more of the Mishnah Brura, written by Rav Israel Meir HaKohen, also known as the Chafetz Chaim. And this is what we mean by Shulchan Aruch. So, first question we have to ask is, why is it that suddenly in the 16th century, one second, I see I have a question here, so let me just take the question. Oh, no, that's just the sources. Okay, so why is it that in the 16th century, codes suddenly start being published? Because this is a new mode. Yes, the Rambam had a code, and yes, the Torah had a code. So the Rambam writes a code in the 12th century, and the Torah in the 13th century. And there were some summary works in the 15th century, but this notion of an all-encompassing code, which wrote about every aspect of practical law, was not unprecedented. Again, the Rambam does have an all-encompassing code, but was definitely not extremely popular, and definitely wasn't something that was found in the average person's bookshelf. So why is it in the 16th century, Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserles are writing codes, and it sweeps the Jewish world within the course of just a few years, such that within the next century, commentaries are being written, halakhic commentaries are no longer just being written on the Gemara, but they're being written on the page of Shulchan Aruch. And this becomes the new frame of reference for much of halachic writing. So there seem to be a few reasons. One is, as we already saw with the writing down of the Mishnah and then the Gemara, there is this idea, and this is what Professor Chorsky hinted at a little bit in the piece that we just glanced at. When the Jewish world goes through a turbulent period, so there's a threat that people will lose their mastery of Torah. The best way to make sure that people maintain their mastery of Torah is to organize it and codify it. So, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, writing in the turbulent years following the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, takes what is a disorganized oral law and tries to organize it and then write it down. The turbulence of the next few hundred years eventually lead to the writing down of the Talmud. And the hint that we get from Yosef Karo's biography, and we'll see that he says this explicitly, is that the 15th century is the years, right, represents the years following a particularly turbulent period in Jewish history, specifically the tragic events of 1492 and the expulsion from Spain, and then the later expulsions from Portugal. So in the late 15th century, there are all these expulsions, so Jews are wandering around the world. Established communities are now reestablishing themselves, or at least trying to. So there's a bit of chaos in the Jewish world. And that means that there is an impulse that we need to somehow organize the information that we have, the Torah that we have, so that we will be able to carry it forward. So that's the first reason that it seems to be that in the 15th century, in the 16th century, this movement towards codes explodes. There are, however, two other very important factors, which either motivated the writing of codes, but more likely is important not just in the story of why it was written, but why it became so popular. And that is the printing press. Right? The 16th century is also when printing becomes a thing, and that makes it much easier for something not just to be written, but to suddenly be publicized and be disseminated across the world, in this case, the Jewish world. And that also seems to be very important to this age of codes and the acceptance of Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah and the commentaries as this new way of writing about halakhah. The third factor that's identified by Joseph Davis in his article here in number 2, the reception of the Shulchan Aruch and the formation of Ashkenazic Jewish identity, is that in the 16th century, Jews weren't the only people who were moving towards codes. This seems to have been the way the world worked. And therefore, Jews were simply following a pattern that was common throughout the world. So he writes, throughout Europe, in France, the Low Countries, Spain, England, Germany, Poland, and the Ottoman Empire, the 16th century was an age of legal codification. In England, Richard Morrison wrote to King Henry VIII in the 1530s, proposing that the common laws of this your realm that now be unwritten might be written, that now be dispersed and uncertain might be gathered together and made certain. A few years earlier, the Polish parliament decreed that all the customs, laws, and ancient statutes should be gathered from every province, that we may begin the reformation of the entire constitution. So you see that Shulchan Aruch is being published in the same century in which codification is just what's happening. That's what's happening to law around the world. So these three factors, the attempt to organize the Torah as the world is in chaos, the Jewish world specifically is in chaos. 2, the ability of the printing press to spread the books that are written. And 3, the fact that the world is moving towards codification. All of that seem to contribute to the massive success of Shulchan Aruch writing in the 16th century. Okay, so now that is a little bit about motivation. We'll see this in the Beit Yosef in just a second. But when we're looking at Beit Yosef, not only will we see motivation, but as we go through, we will also move to the next question, which is, okay, what is the methodology used to create these codes, and what does this tell us about the history of Psak? So here in source 3, we have Rabbi Yosef Karo's introduction to his encyclopedic work, the Beit Yosef. So again, just to remind ourselves, he writes many works, but we'll focus here on 2. He writes an encyclopedic work meant for rabbis as a commentary on the Arba Turim, called the Beit Yosef, in which he collects basically the entire history of Psak for the rabbinic authority to analyze and have access to. And then he writes a summary called Shulchan Aruch for the average person to read through. For those of you who have ever looked at Shulchan Aruch, you know it's quite long. But Rabbi Yosef Karo himself actually thought that the average person, the average member of the laity, should review Shulchan Aruch on a monthly basis. So he really did imagine that it was a how-to guide that was easily accessible. It is easily accessible, but not maybe as accessible as he thought it was. But those are the 2 works that we're talking about. So if you look here in his introduction, we won't read it all inside, but I'll highlight some key lines here. So he tells you, why did he write this book? Why did he embark on this process of organization and the like? So the first thing he highlights is, as we noted, times were turbulent, and therefore it was time to organize. And that's what it writes here, Vahi ki orchalanu hayamim, as the days have lengthened. We have been emptied from one vessel to the other, and we've walked in exile. V'kama tzarot surot kufot, v'tzarot zolazo, and we have all these terrible things that have happened to us, one after the other. Which has led to the loss of the curse of Yeshayahu, which is that the wise ones will lose their wisdom. And he says, and the strength of Torah has gone, and those who study it, and the Torah is no longer just 2 Torahs, which is the fear that is described in the Talmud. The Torah has has splintered into an endless number of Torah. So the first thing is that there's been so much chaos in the Jewish world that has led to chaos in the process of Psak. So just like we saw 2 and 3 weeks ago, that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, in the aftermath of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, decided that we needed to codify the Mishnah, Yosef Karo, writing in the 16th century, says it's time to reorganize our sources, because all the things that have happened to the Jewish people have made it that the material of halakhah is overwhelming and is disorganized, and we just need help. And he says, look, why am I doing this now? He said, maybe you'll tell me that ideally every law should just be examined directly from the Talmud. He says, good luck. That's very hard. I mean, be realistic, people. Said even if you knew where it was in the Talmud, and it would take a long time to take that and go through the commentaries and figure out what to do. But first you got to find it in the Talmud, which is also not easy because it's not organized, right? It's not organized in that way. It's not organized in an easily accessible way. So good luck. So then he says, well, maybe there are books out there that you can rely on. Why am I writing a new type of book? There are certain summary works that existed. He says, it seems short, but it's not. That's going to be hard. They are too short, right? They are too short, too concise. They just don't get the law right. Or they're not clear enough. They're not extensive enough. You're going to mess up because they are incomplete. And therefore, because of all this, he writes, Al Kain Ani Hadal Ba'alfei Yosef, I, the weak, the poor one, the required humility statements at the beginning of every rabbinic sefer, not all, admittedly. He has other works where he's not like this. In this work, he describes himself, Ani Hadal, me, the poor, Yosef. Who am I? But what else am I supposed to do? In his mystical work, Magid Beisharim, which is, as he writes, the record of his study sessions with his private angel. Don't ask me what that means. I have literally no idea. But there he writes about himself that he is Yosef. He quotes the angel as saying that he is Yosef Hamechune Karo. He is Pasakna Rabba Dara Israel. I might be misquoting it slightly. The greatest Halakhic authority of Israel, Mechabarna Rabba Dara Israel, the greatest author in Israel, Yosef Hamechune Karo, Yosef Karo, Asher Melech Malchei Hamlachim Chafetz Bikaro. And quoting from the Megillah that we read this week, who God himself loves him. Quoting from, right? So, in other words, he's not quite as humble, but in this week, work he is. So he says, because of all this, I decided I don't have any choice. So what am I going to do? Hiskamti lechaber sefer kolel kol adinim nohagim b'veyur shehem motzaehem me'agmara im kol chilukei svarot aposkim ish lo ne'edar. So I decided I am going to collect all practical law from the Talmud with all later authorities, ish lo ne'edar, bar none. I will create a collection, encyclopedia, of every single halachic authority that I know of on every practical law that is relevant in modern day. Everything. That's it. That is my small task that I took on myself. I have a question. No, still okay. So he explains, right, as we said, because of the turbulence in the Jewish world and the difficulty of finding things in the Talmud and the added problems that were created because it's hard enough under good circumstances, but the Jews are under bad circumstances, he takes on to write an encyclopedia and begin to organize the law. And he tells you quickly who he includes in it. I won't read them all, but you can see here, this whole paragraph is just names. He puts, I include the Talmud, Rashi, Tosfot, Ran, Rif, Rosh, Mordechai, Rambam, Hagot, Magen Mishnah, Yerucham, Sefer HaTruma, Shibbolei Leket, Rokeach, Sharei Dura, Tajbeitz, Itur, Nimuka Yosef, Smak, Orchud Chaim, Torah Rabbi, Hagot, Ashri, Manhig, Agur, Sefer, Balei Nevesh, Larayvet. It doesn't matter if you know all these or you don't know all them. The point is, he's taken on quite a daring task. And he's just showing how hard things are. And then at the end he says, which is important for a topic for another time, sometimes he includes the Kabbalistic material of the Zohar. Okay, so now what? What's he going to do with all that information? I mean, that's a lot of information. So what do you do? So what he said is, here's his methodology. Va'ala b'da'ati, שאחר כל הדברים אפסוק הלכה ואכריע בין הסברות. כי זהו תכלית לנו תורה אחת ומשפט אחד. Said, my goal here is to issue a halachic ruling. And here we begin to get the next philosophical value that drove him. I had to make a decision because I want there to be unified law. Right? One of the problems of the Galut is that there is not unified law. And therefore, the whole goal is to get a unified law. So how is he going to get a unified law? So he says, first of all, I don't think that I am greater than the Rishonim, so I don't think that I can rule directly from the Gemara. Because even if I think that they're wrong, they were smarter than me, so they probably understood my question. They had an answer, even if I don't know what it is. He says, who would have the audacity to say that they have new arguments that have never been seen? So he says, I'm not going to rule straight from the Talmud. I'm not going to try to figure out who's right. What am I going to do? לכן הסכמתי בדעתי כי לחיות שלושת עמודי ההוראה אשר הבית בית ישראל נשען עליהם בהוראותיהם. I'm going to pick the three major authorities that Jews already rely on. The Rambam, Maimonides, the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, writing in the 10th century in Morocco, Varash, and Rabbeinu Asher, writing in the 13th century, who begins at the Baal HaTosfot in Germany and then moves to Spain. I'm going to take them and I'm going to rule based on simple majority, best of three. And if...
So Rabbi Yosef Karo is outlined, right? He said, look, things have been bad. The Torah is endless as it is, and things have gotten crazy. So I'm going to take the small task of organizing everything that ever existed, basically. But that's not how I'm going to rule. I'm going to rule based on simple majority. I'm going to take the three main halakhic authorities that I know of. As far as I'm concerned, the most important authorities, the ones that Jews have accepted, the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rush. And I'm going to take the best of three. That's his methodology of psak. That's his methodology of halachic ruling. And if he says, if one of them doesn't weigh in, so then I'll rely on other people. But fundamentally, that's my methodology. Now, at first glance, if we step out for a moment from the historical to the methodological, what you see is that Rabbi Yosef Karo believes that, at least until this point, that the ideal vision for halakhah is a single view, right? A unified Jewish practice. And he says that's the whole point. Because of these the turbulent times, not only have we forgotten Torah, but simply we have different practices, and that's a problem. And therefore, part of what motivates him is a belief that there should be a single halachic psak. Now, this is problematic because if there's supposed to be one psak, it's not nice to stack the deck in favor of, your chosen tradition, which is essentially what he does, because the Rambam considered himself essentially the spiritual student, not the direct student, but the spiritual student of the Rif. And in 90% of cases, he rules like the Rif, because his father, Maimon, was a student of the Rimegash, or Yosef ibn Megaz, however you want to pronounce it, who was a student of the Rif, of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, and therefore, by saying you're going to pick the best of three between the Rif, Rambam, and Rush, what you're really saying is that there should be one psak for everyone, and that psak should be essentially the Sephardi tradition. So at first glance, you would say that Rabbi Yosef Karo, part of this codification, is an attempt to unify psak behind Sephardi halachic rulings. However, he does backtrack slightly, and how you work this out with his view is not clear, right? Because he does, for the rest of his introduction, this seems to be his methodology. But in his last two lines, he says, "V'im b'ktzat aratzot nahagu isur b'ktzat dvarim, af al pi sh'anu nachriya behefech." But if there are certain places that treat something as forbidden, even though I rule differently, yachziku b'minhagam, they should follow their halachic ruling and their customs, ki kvar kiblu aleim divrei hachacham ha'oser v'asur lahem l'minhog heter. Because they've already ruled that it should be forbidden, and therefore they can't be permitted. So even though his stated goal is to unify the Jewish people at this stage in the Galut, in this stage of the exile behind one halachic position, he does acknowledge the fact that there is still room. It's not going to be totally uniform, because where there is deep-seated customs, he acknowledges that people should follow the views that they've already been following. So that's Rabbi Yosef Karo's vision in writing the Shulchan Aruch. So why does Rabbi Moshe Isserles jump in and write his comments? So he has several critiques of Rabbi Yosef Karo. Fundamentally, he agrees that there's a need to codify halacha, to organize things. But he has a few critiques of the methodology chosen by Rabbi Yosef Karo. His main critique is what he is. I put here in bold. Hashlishit v'hu ha'ikar. What's my main problem? V'hu ha'tachlit ha'mevukash b'zeh machkar. Ki yadu ha'sharav ha'mechaber Beit Yosef. I know that the Beit Yosef, what did he do? V'tiv'o el ha'gedolim nichsaf. Methodologically speaking, he thinks that the way to create psak is to weigh the earlier authorities. And the way he did that specifically was pasak halacha b'chol makom al pi shnei u'shlosha idim. And he tries to get either 2 or 3 out of 3. Hema gaonim anechmadim. Admittedly, the wonderful geniuses, harif haramam v'harash, b'chol makom shnei mehem darachat minitzvadim. Whenever 2 agree, then he rules like that. And if they didn't weigh in, so then he rules like others. But he says, I don't like this, because if you're trying to make a unified psak for the whole world, you can't ignore an entire tradition, namely what he essentially views himself as the heir of the Ashkenazi tradition. Because what about all of us? What about all the people that we have followed? Birosham, Maharik, Maharai, B'Tshuvah Animo. What about all these books? And not just that, and also, he may have paid lip service to custom, but by ignoring the books that are part of our canon, our collections of customs, you have ignored the Ashkenazi world. Asher rubam b'nuyim ala klala zeh b'pshitut utmimut. And Ashkenazi psak, as much as it cares about authority, cares much more about custom. And therefore, these collections of customs that we have, that in the end of the day is often the bottom line for Ashkenazi psak. We don't challenge them. We don't question them. I don't want to argue on them either. And therefore, and that's why I don't just add sources. I write practice and say, this is the minhag, this is the custom. The kol davar katavti alav shem amro v'lo amarti me'atzmi, and I tell you who said it, etc. So the Ramosha Israelis comes in and he says, look, I more or less agree that there's a need for codes nowadays, but I disagree with the methodology. I don't think that you only care about sources and you weigh out sources. You have to care about the lived practice of the Jewish people. And if you want to codify what it is that Jews are supposed to do, you can't just look at books. Ashkenazim, we care about custom. And therefore, when I tried to figure out what you should do, I wrote down, this is what we do. And therefore, it is binding. So on the one hand, Ramosha Israelis agrees with the Beit Yosef in a need for organizing psak. But while the Beit Yosef thinks that under most circumstances, halakhah should be ruled based on books and the majority, and if there's a strong custom, then that might override it, the Ramah says no. In Ashkenaz, at least, custom was the determining factor. And therefore, especially when Ashkenazi custom diverged from what the Beit Yosef wrote, he added his comments to tell Ashkenazim, this is what you could do. This is what you should do, against what the Beit Yosef wrote. So in a certain sense, Rabbi Yosef Karo and Ramosha Israelis have two competing visions. One is based on a balance of authority. The other is based on custom, even though each has a little bit of the other. But the Beit Yosef is more based on authority, with a little bit of room for custom. And Ramosha Israelis says a lot of custom, but obviously taking into account sources. But both of them agreed here in the 16th century that the right move for halakhah was to organize itself around codes. There was, however, another vision. And this was from Ramosha Israelis' cousin, Rav Shlomo Luria, writing in the Sefer Yam Shel Shlomo, also in the 16th century in Poland, who attacks not just the methodology of Ramosha Isserles and Rabbi Yosef Karo, but the entire enterprise. And he says, look, I'll say it outside, but here he says, look, I don't like codes. Not just Rabbi Yosef Karo's code, not just Ramosha Isserles' comments. I don't like codes. I don't like the Rambam's either. You know, we don't like taking on the Rambam. Rosh Luria was happy with it. He said, I don't like the Rambam either. I mean, I like him, but I don't like the idea of codes, period. That's not how halacha works. Halacha is messy. And the way to rule on halacha is to go back to the Talmud, understand the Talmud, trace the authorities as hard as it is. I know that Rabbi Yosef Karo said it's hard. It is hard, but too bad. That's how halacha works. We don't need a unified psak. What we need is a psak in which each person who is qualified to analyze the sources looks at the Talmud and tries to understand what the law should be. And his superhero is not the Rambam, but it is Tosfot. Because the Bali Tosfot, they don't write codes. I mean, some of them do, but most of them don't. What they write is comments on the side of the Talmud that help you organize not just the localized comments of the Talmud, but the Talmud as a unit, right? They try to revolve contradictions in order to make it that, as he describes it, the Talmud is one big ball, right? It's no longer a set of individual texts, but it's a unified text, and law emerges from that. So here in the 16th century, you have one view, which is we need to start organizing either based on authorities, which is Rabbi Yosef Karo with a little bit of custom, but respect to the authorities, Ramosha Isserles, and that, but both of them agree that codification is valuable. And then you have Rosh Luria who comes in and says this entire enterprise is flawed. That's not how psak works. What you're supposed to do is take each thing and figure out what you think is true, and that's how you rule halakhically. So this is what happens in the 16th century. Who wins? So, in a certain sense, codification won, at least for a while. But in a certain sense, it lost. It won in the sense that a lot more people read Shulchan Aruch and Ramah than they read the Yam Shel Shlomo. Because it's easier to use, because it's organized, etc. But ironically, in a certain sense, the reason Shulchan Aruch won is because Rabbi Yosef Karo's vision of a unified singular psak lost. Right? It became accepted because Ramosha Isserles added his comments, which meant that even on the page of Shulchan Aruch itself, it doesn't have one ruling, it has multiple rulings. And then in the 100 and 200 years that followed, as the commentaries wrote around Shulchan Aruch, broadly speaking, became more accepted, but the actual rulings of Yosef Karo and Ramosha Isserles became less binding because there were now more commentaries that were considered in play, right? Meaning everybody on the page of Shulchan Aruch is, part of Shulchan Aruch, broadly speaking. So in a certain sense, codification won, but codification won because this was a code unlike the world had ever seen. It wasn't a code that gave you one law. It was more of an organizational principle that collected different traditions of halachic ruling in one place. But that's basically how the situation stood for a few hundred years until, and we'll talk about this more next week and the week after that, until more like the 18th century with the Shiva movement and the Vilna Gaon, where the value of turning to the text itself became much more important. And psak began to rewrite itself a little bit there, but that we'll talk about a little bit in coming weeks. But this is the situation essentially in the 16th century. Okay. But now we got to ask the question, for whom are these written? Meaning, Shulchan Aruch says, on the one hand, I'm writing a code. I want a single psak. But at the end, he says, unless you have a long-standing custom, then you can rule differently. So you have to ask, okay, so who exactly did he think he was writing for? Right? Who did he think he was writing for? If he said there should be one psak unless you have a different custom, meaning how unified did he want the world to be? So he addresses this question in one of his collection of tshuvot, of responsive literature, here in number 6 in the Avkat Rochel, where he was essentially asked this question. And he was asked, someone turned to him and he said, look, I was asked this question about certain kashrus question, where there's some people who are unsure about the law. In Ashkenaz, they used to forbid this. I won't get into the details. So why is Rabbi Yosef Karo being asked the question? So as I mentioned, part of what drove codification was the turbulence of the 16th century following the expulsions in Spain and Portugal. But broadly speaking, the Jewish world was moving. This is a problem because traditionally, halakhah is very geographically based because people had their customs from the cities that they lived in for generations. But if the world is shaken up, now you got to figure out, do I keep my old customs or my new customs? So Rabbi Yosef Karo was tested. What did he really think Shulchan Aruch was? By being asked, what happens when a group of Ashkenazim move to a quote-unquote Sephardi land? What do they do? Do they follow their parents? Do they keep their ethnic identity, let's say, for halakhic purposes? Or do they have to accept the halachic rulings of the place they have moved into? Because you need a unified ruling. What do? So he says, I'll just cut to the chase. Harei hadavar beveirur shekol isha yotzei mimakom shemachmirim lemakom shemikilin ve'ein do lachzor lemkamo de'eino nohei kiminhaga makom sheyatza misham ela kiminhaga makom shalach l'sham. It is clear when you leave a place where they're stringent and you come to a place where they're lenient, you follow the new rule. Ve'imkein benidon didan. So in our case, kishabau ha'ashkenazim l'malchut hazeh. If Ashkenazim move into this place, into this kingdom, yesh lem linho kiminhagei mikamot elu v'lo kiminhagei mikamot shiatzu misham. You've come to a new place, you follow the local rules. That's it. And maybe you'll tell me, maybe you think that's only when an individual comes and moves into a new city. So now he assimilates into the majority Jewish culture. Maybe you'll say that if an entire ethnic community picks up from France and moves to Spain, they can maintain their identity and have two separate subcultures? No. That is wrong. Just like an individual assimilates into the majority culture, so too does a community. And therefore, Rabbi Yosef Karo, you begin to understand why he thinks that codification is a good idea. Because he thinks that communities are defined geographically, and it doesn't matter how many ethnic identities end up in one place, whatever the practice is in that place, you create a unified psak. And that's it, a unified halakhic ruling. And then you sort of understand why he likes code so much. He's willing to acknowledge that maybe off in some place where they have a different custom, they can keep it. But he thinks fundamentally there should be a unified psak as much as possible. And the notion that while the world is being shaken up, we should give in to that and allow for halakhic subgroups to exist in a community, he says, under no circumstances will I accept that. And you understand why he cares, therefore, about codification. Because his view for halakhic rulings is ideally uniformity. And therefore, even when he's pushed and he says, isn't the world shaken up and there are displaced communities, shouldn't you respect that? His answer is no. We need unity. And therefore, I'm going to write a code, right? These work together. This is the way he views the world. But there's another vision that exists at this time. And that is, and this will become very clear in the next 2 weeks, a view that says, no, as the world is shaken up, geography starts to lose its hold over halakhah, and there is legitimacy to ethnic communities emerging and having individualized psak. And this you see in the Magen Avram Gumbina writing in the 17th century, but quoting the Arizal, the Kabbalist, in the 15th, 16th century. And he writes, and this is a well-known passage, he writes, Arizal lohaya omer piyutim upizmonim elamasha sidra rishonim. The Arizal used to only say the poems and the liturgical poems that are in the Sidur. But he wrote, Omnam minhagim shenagu b'shar shei tefillah ein lishanot miminhag mikomo. But your customs in prayer don't change. Keep your custom. Ki yudbet sharim b'shamayim neged yudbet shvatim. Because there are 12 paths in heaven, 12 gates in heaven, parallel to the 12 tribes. V'kol shevet yesh lo shar u'minhag, levan v'ashin izkar b'gemara, etc. Now, what does he mean? Does he mean that different geographies keep their customs? Or does he think that different people keep the customs of the place from which they came? So, the Arizal, it seems pretty clear, means the latter. Right? He's the beginning of someone who believes that multiple halachic communities can exist in a single place. How do we know this? We know this because his nickname while living in Israel, which is where Rabbi Yosef Karo is, which is a Sephardi culture, his nickname was Rav Yitzchak HaAshkenazi. One of his nicknames was the Ashkenazi. Right? That's what he was known as. And it's clear that he's not just saying that different places have different customs. He's saying different people or different communities in each place can keep their custom. So you begin to have these different visions during the era of codification, the age of codification, of whether the ideal is a single psak, and each geography at least has a single community, or do we start to recognize the existence of ethnic, as it were, identities within the halachic world and give legitimacy to their positions? Nowhere was this most pronounced than in the fight over the Ramah. Because as we saw, the Ramah wrote the Ashkenazi position, because clearly he thought that no one had hegemony over the entire halachic world. But who did he write his book for? So he writes it for Ashkenazim, but what did he mean by Ashkenazim? So this got a little bit complicated. So the Ramah himself writes that he's writing for the Ashkenaz, and then he says he's writing for the customs for the customs that spread out in his place. So it's clear that he's making a geographic claim, that he's ruling for his place. But how big is his place, right? Is his place Poland? Or is his place Poland, Germany, France, Hungary, etc.? Right? Basically, anything that's not quote unquote Sephardi is now Ashkenazi. And does he represent a belief in localized customs and localized halachic ruling? Or does he represent a shift to pan-geographic halachic rulings that create meta-communities? So in a fascinating piece, which I gave you here in 9, Rav Chaim ben Bitzalel, writing in the 16th century, says that this was a fight between the printers and the Ramah himself. And he says, if you look at the original Ramah, the Ramah wrote that he was paskening for Poland and Russia. But in the printers added and Ashkenaz and Germany. And he argues that it was the printers. The Ramah believed in localized custom, but the printers, because they wanted to sell books, started pushing a vision of pan-Ashkenazi identity in order to make it that everyone would accept it. So what you have is this fascinating thing that, according to him, it's not just that the printing press is what enabled codification. It's what actually spurred the disputes over how do you define community for the first purposes of halachic ruling. Right? So you have Rabbi Yosef Karo, who thinks ideally there should be one psak for everybody. You have Rosh Shlomo Luria, who said, no, everyone should just interpret the Gemara as they see fit. And you have the Ramah, who says you should stick to custom. But the question is, what custom? Local custom, which might be what the Ramah himself said? Or does the shakeup in the world and the ability to have the printing press create international communication, does that force us to move towards a model where we think about community on macro levels, and therefore we don't have one unified psak, but we do have unified halachic communities across geographic lines, right? So the printing press doesn't just enable codification, it forces different conceptualizations of what it means to be a community, and therefore the question of who you're writing for. One more model seems to emerge, which is in a certain sense similar to what we saw in Rosh Shlomo Luria, but is even more localized. Rabbi Elazar Mizrahi, writing slightly before Rabbi Yosef Karo, also acknowledges this notion that people are moving around and there are ethnic subcommunities living in quote-unquote Sephardi lands. And he says, Sharei Shema Ashkenazi b'makom zein arotz lomar shebam malachet Ashkenaz, ela shumi mikilat ha'Ashkenazim ha'darim b'Constantina. He said, Ashkenazi here in Constantinople means someone who used to live in Ashkenaz and now moved to a Sephardi land, but davens in the Ashkenazi shul. So you begin to see yet another model, right? You have Rosh Shlomo Luria, poskin based on the Gemara. Don't go for codes. Always try to understand the law yourself. Rabbi Yosef Karo says, ideally, we should have one halachic ruling based on a balance of authority. The Ramah says, no, we should have customs which are respected. But is that localized to single countries? Or, as the printers seem to have believed, do we move because of the ability of publication to unify the world? Do we move towards pan-geographic identities and rule based on that? And then you have this model that from the Arizal and maybe from Elazar Mizrahi, that no, you can have multiple halachic realities living in a single community. You can have different sub-communities. So while in a certain sense, the 16th century is a victory of codes, you see that at the same time, what it means to write a code and who it's binding on, that question is beginning to be asked, and the answer the question of who are you writing for is just as important as is this text accepted? Because maybe it's accepted, but what does it mean it's accepted? Right? Who do you think you're writing for? What do you think community is? What does it mean to write halakha? And that's really, I think, the important point to understand about the age of codes. Because in the next 2 weeks, what we're going to talk about is, well, what happens in the 500 years following that? Because if in the 16th century, they're already talking about people moving from one country to another, and therefore trying to figure out, do you view the Jewish world as one big community that ideally has one halakhic rule, or do you think in meta communities, or do you think in localized countries, or do you think in identity communities within every locale, and every shul has its own identity? As important as it was at the beginning of the Age of Codes, in the 500 years that followed, and especially in the 20th and 21st century, moving to America and Canada and Israel and England and things like that, the game completely changed. And what we're going to have to do is figure out, how did it change? And what does that tell us about what it means to be a community and what that means for halakha? And to note that it's not totally clear whether what drove this and the acceptance of certain authorities in certain communities, whether it's purely based on halakhic methodology or not. So to highlight this, if you look at the Sma writing in a little bit later than the Ramah, he says, okay, the Ramah clearly was successful and was accepted across country lines, even if some people protested it. But he tries to figure out where did they accept the Ramah? So he has this shocking comment, and he says, Gam l'rabot sharif ramam nishachim achreim la'yu mibnei Ashkenaz v'Tzarfat v'garam lehen gam zeh lishonot shelo shonim katav p'skein hayu b'lashon Aravit ma she'en kin lashon Ashkenazim v'Tzarfatim. He said, you know what it depends on? It depends what language you spoke. Arabic-speaking countries define themselves as Sephardi, and therefore they follow the Shulchan Aruch. And Yiddish or whatever, Polish, Russian, those languages, the people who could converse, they accepted the Ramah. Now, that doesn't seem to be a halachic comment. But what the Sma, Rabbi Shua Falk, seems to indicate is that the question of who gets accepted isn't just a formal legal question. It has a lot to do with culture. Because as the world is shaken up, and it's unclear how you're supposed to formulate law and how you're supposed to relate to community as communities change, so people fall back on culture to figure out who they are. And this is seen in a fascinating way. I gave you here a map, but there was a dissertation written about Rav Shlomo Kluger's Psak by Chaim Gartner. Rav Shlomo Kluger was an authority writing later on in the 19th century, 19th century, who became very influential in certain parts of Europe. And in this dissertation, they highlighted, where did he become authoritative? So in the present case, Rav Shlomo Kluger's sphere of influence largely corresponds to the areas where Mideastern and Southeastern dialects of Yiddish were spoken, where the gefilte fish was sweet, not savory. It turns out that our guiding question, what goes into a rabbi's decision about who to turn to for answers to difficult questions, is answered in part by culture. Rabbis were more likely to entrust such questions to a greater rabbi within the same cultural sphere. That is in the case of Galicia, to a rabbi who made latkes from kartoflin, not bulbas. I don't know what the difference is, but what you begin to see is that this picture is complicated, not just by formal halachic argumentation, but by culture. Because as people think about how to redefine the world as it's shaken up, they don't just go to classic halacha, but they go to cultural points. And that helps shape the way they think about community and therefore the way they think about psak. Okay, I think we'll stop here. the points that I have here can be easily tied into next week. So the extent to which I need these sources, I'll bring them into next week's discussion. But what we're going to be doing, as I said, in the next 2 weeks, is really continuing on this conversation, which is, okay, we see why codes became popular in the 16th century, but we also see the complexities that arose there in terms of defining community and trying to figure out who you're writing for and how you're writing to them and who's going to accept you. And as I said, those questions are only going to be exacerbated in the generations that follow. And what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks is trace that from the 16th century, slowly but surely, to the 21st century, and try to define our current moment of Psak and understand how these forces have defined the way we think about community and the way that affects the way we think about halachic ruling and the like. So that's what we will do in the next 2 weeks.
Thank you. That works great. So thank you, Rabbi Ziring. I'm looking forward, those who are leaving us now, I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. And thank you. Many, many thanks to everyone who joined us today, not only on Zoom, but also on Drisha Live and on Facebook. We continue our spring program tomorrow, Tuesday at 1 p.m. with the second class in a series on the world of doubt between human and divine, between law and reality, with Rabbi Yael Shimoni. So I hope to see you there. In addition, we always have many more classes happening, so you can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes, or you can watch live at www.drisha.org/live.